All right, I'm gonna pick a new word here. Unless,
Oh, can I
unless
get
you.
it? Can I get it? I want the word.
Okay, who's this?
Daniel, what's up?
Daniel. Okay, cool. All right, Daniel. Your word is imagination.
Imagination. Oh, I love it. Okay. Imagination is the ability to conceive of a reality that is not the exact one that you perceive right now, whether in the past or the future, I'll point out, is the way my definition was phrased.
Hmm.
And furthermore, I'll give a second definition, a la Webster's. The the ability to entertain thoughts that you don't agree with, right?
Hmm.
Like, there's a famous quote that's along these lines, but like, I think that without imagination, we cannot ever live up to that. We cannot hope to entertain something that we don't agree with unless we can imagine a
Uh-huh.
world that's framed differently. I guess that's where I'll leave it.
It sounds like imagination is a peacemaker.
I
Uh,
think it's actually I would say let's add a third definition. Imagination is a useful tool in the human psychological toolbox. And honestly, if you lack it, you're kind of like broken in a way. Like you're lacking something severely that really reduces your empathy in so many ways. Right? To Kill a Mockingbird is about putting yourself in someone else's shoes. How can you do that with imagination?
you're saying imagination is useful,
It's necessary for empathy.
necessary.
How
Hmm.
would you have empathy with unless you literally share their circumstance, which arguably doesn't make it empathy, it's just commiseration at that point. So how would you have empathy without imagination?
Yeah.
Yeah, imagination is reality 2.0, and it's a great servant and a horrible master.
Hmm. Reality 2.0.
I don't know if this is the direction you want to go, but I'm curious what is meant by the servant master comment.
Yeah.
Well, if you are remembering, an imagination would be remembering the past, and you take that past and imagine that it's going to be the future, and you get hugely stressed and are suffering from it, then it becomes your master rather than a servant. In other words, you become attached to your imagination as reality in that moment, as opposed to just reality.
Is this quote or idea then only true when imagination is tied to time? I asked this question because I canceled a room I was going to have about a half hour ago where I was asking people if you were to build your dream home and each doorway was a portal, where would each room in your home be? I.e., would you put the bedroom on the dark side of the moon, or in the middle of a nebula, etc.? And these have no concept or connection to time, right? You can imagine any sort of space anywhere in the universe and place these rooms, and yet you're still using your imagination, and there's a distance, so you know that there's no conceptual connection to reality either.
Well, you would have to have a concept of the dark side of the moon from the past, and then project what it would be like in the future. So yeah, I would say that imagination is always time bound, and not reality, the original or the real reality, to say it that way.
So does this mean that You cannot imagine anything that you have not previously experienced?
I haven't yet. Can you?
I can imagine all sorts of crazy, wild things that don't even exist. That
Like
because
what?
they don't exist, they can't be within space time.
Well, I would argue
I
that
mean,
those are composites of a multiplicity of things.
okay, but even if that's the case, there's no connection to time, is there?
Yeah, because it would have to have come from something you experienced, seen, and sensed or perceived in some way.
I don't know that I'm seeing things the same way. I think I hear what you're saying, though.
I think this is why the Buddhists say, or the Buddha said, and along with other great thinkers like Einstein, say that reality is an illusion, albeit a persistent one.
I wonder if this might help. Like, I've never experienced a unicorn, which I would say is like this white horse with a horn. Um, but I've experienced a white horse and I've experienced horns, and I'm putting those two together, and those are ideas that I've had from the past. And even though I've never experienced a unicorn, I've experienced what I can create from what I have experienced into that unicorn, and that's how I imagine a unicorn. Is that kind of close to what you're saying about um, imagination requiring things that we've experienced in the past?
Yeah, it's really interesting too because, when you consider art, for an example, this uses a lot of imagination. And, myself, whenever I've tried to come up with, just doodlings that are original, um, I always find that there's something, there's, it's not very compelling when I come up with things that are so disjointed or not disjointed, have no association with anything I've ever seen before. Like, for example, like drawing faces without two eyes would, um, it would, there's at some point where you just wouldn't consider it a face anymore. And you wouldn't, and depending on what you're doing, you might not consider it art that's valid or worth saving, you know. And so I think this kind of is related to what you were saying.
Hmm.
But if we're creating it from the imagination, don't we have the ability to redefine what a face is?
It depends, I don't, I can't imagine it. Let's put it that way. How do you, where do you go with that? How do you redefine, the word face has some very specific things about it that at some point it stops being a face to yourself or others, you know?
I mean, we could use it as a very general term, such as the front-facing edge of a cube or something, right? It's facing us does not necessarily mean it is a face. And so, from that perspective, if we are creating some sort of an entity or being, then whatever it is that faces us, it is the somehow leading portion of the body could be interpreted as a face in some way. You could
Yeah.
have all sorts of things incorporated into whatever that is.
Yeah. And it gets very nebulous at that point, right. The face or facade of a building. Um, right. So, but in that sense, though, we're still not redefining the word. We're just using the broader definitions that come under the word face.
I guess I was meaning that I didn't see a face as being limited to a mouth, a nose, 2, 3, 4 eyes, etc. That there were many other ways to configure or create something like that.
Yeah, I agree with that. And as you were talking, I was remembering some interesting doodling that I've done in the past, where there's like, I don't know, 6 or 8 eyes and just going across. And the way I did it, I mean, it looked pretty compelling, but it's still eyes, and I pushed the limit of this thing. Some of the things I drew, somebody said they looked like they were Picasso ripoffs, where the heads are malformed, and it's a really interesting exercise to see how far it can go before it stops looking like a face. And yeah, in this sense, I mean something human. But just to cap this off, I think this is what it is. We've got concepts and images going back to imagination that have been accumulated through a lot of years, and so when you look at any great artwork, the most original stuff, there has to be something familiar about it, and also something unique about it, that those parts haven't been put together like that before. And this is true with pretty much any art, music. If it's too unfamiliar, it's no longer compelling. And and but so I think it has to have a little bit of both, the familiarity and the original side of it, where things have never been quite done that way before, or received that way before. There's an expression that there's nothing new under the sun, and I think that's ultimately true. But whether it's innovations or art or whatever, it's still coming from a past and the past concepts that aren't present in the reality.
So the way I tackle it is from the neuronal neuro developmental perspective. Um, Babies start to model the world. They see hundreds, if not thousands, of cups, and they create an image of what that cup is. Um, so you can, from those textures, colors, sensations that you have in relationship to objects, textures, colors, um, sounds, all these inputs that are coming into your brain, they're engraving information, right? And the brain is able to create new realities that could be, like Christina said, completely alien to most of us, but they're made up of these, right? You couldn't, if you didn't have the input of these objects, of these, qualia, whatever you want to call them, of all this information, you couldn't create, you couldn't imagine, right? You couldn't create, your brain couldn't come up with these things. So, but and the thing is, it's such an infinite amount of information that your brain, I don't know if this is the right word, but amalgamates. It puts together, and you can create things that are really unfathomable, and you think, how did my brain come up with that, or where does this come from? But it's just the way the brain works, and I don't think there's anything mystic or strange about it. If you take psychedelics, it's your neurons are gonna just fire all over the place, or if you get your brain stimulated in any way, you can have these experiences that people say, oh, this it cannot be of this world, but it's just your brain putting together stuff, and your neuronal pathways just firing like crazy. It's like when you hear people uh, being having electrodes or or your brain stimulated, and they start, I don't know, there's this strange horror movie that or I don't know what it was, but it was somebody with their open brain, and somebody and they were like in a medical theater, and the guy, they started stimulating the brain, and he started laughing and just going wild. So I think that's all that's happening. There's nothing otherworldly about it. It's just the nature of the brain.
Sometimes I think of like how things like imagination have been useful, like evolutionarily speaking. Um, and I kind of like what Daniel said about, you need imagination in order to have empathy, because if you can't imagine yourself in somebody else's shoes, how can you empathize with them? But I was curious if there were any other evolutionary
Invention.
uh, reasons.
Invention. Obviously invention, right? Invention, like the idea of like inventing a better trap, almost
Mhm.
requires you to have empathy to imagine what it's like to be like a bunny running through a bunny trail, right? Right?
Yeah, or
It's kind of weird.
inventing a better spear, or
I mean, yeah,
cutting
or
tool.
like having the idea to invent the bow and arrow or a
Uh-huh.
sling instead of throwing the rock directly.
Yeah,
Flint
and all
for
that
fire.
takes imagination.
Yeah, all that takes a minute, like, or at least the willingness to experiment, which arguably I think is, if it's not like directly tied to imagination, it's so tangential that like we might as well tie them together, in my opinion.
Yeah, without imagination, we wouldn't have a god or religions.
Yeah,
Or
can
science,
imagination be
sadly,
harmful?
James. Isn't that weird?
Ah, I would give pushback on science because whether or not you study it, it happens.
What's a hypothesis, James? Oh,
The hypothesis
damn.
that well, evolution is a part of science,
First
right?
step in making an experiment is having a hypothesis, which requires,
Imagination. There you go. Well, actually,
yeah.
observation. You don't have to imagine what you're seeing.
Observation is step 2 in science, sir.
Oh,
Hypothesis, step 1.
okay. Yeah, you got me there, Daniel. Good one.
Hmm. Yeah, especially if we see science as a process and not see science as, what's happening.
Ooh, okay, yeah. Well, maybe the next word should be science on that note.
Oh, I don't know if I should put science in here. I may have. I don't know. I don't even know what's in here, to be honest with you.
Are you
But
pulling them out of a
Yeah,
bucket of
do
water?
you have like a random number generator pulling words at random from an Excel
n-
spreadsheet? What the hell's going on here, David?
no, these are words that whenever I'm out tabling, like doing SE out in the public and waiting for somebody to look at my sign, I'll just write words that I have a hard time defining, and what seems like other people have a hard time defining, and I'll just put them on my little sticky notes and stick them in this can. And then next thing you know, you got like 100 words in this can.
It's really interesting. I like the talk about the words and then extending it to a beyond the literal meaning of it. It's good discussion. I just was thinking about this concept of science and imagination, and thinking how much of it requires imagination, how much of it is really looking at things that are obvious, and then you ask the question, why that is the case. So again, sometimes really obvious things, an object falling, and somebody asking an obvious thing, people don't think about it, and asking why. So again, the banality or obviousness, sometimes there's really good areas for science, scientists actually think about these things. And, the sun is shining. Why? I mean, it could be obvious. You've seen it for thousands of years. So anyway, I was just thinking out loud in my head as relating imagination to science.
Einstein has a great quote, something along the lines of, I never made one of my discoveries through the rational thinking, or something like that. The exact wording's in my profile, but I often like to interpret that as a little chaos, a little imagination, a little creativity, and a little fun, just mixing it up.
Einstein, in many ways, is kind of a special case, though, right? Like, much of his work was really based on thought experiments, right? Which, like, you only get to do that when you're literally breaking the brand newest of grounds, right? Or like you're postulating ideas that are about to overturn things, and then you later do the math to like overturn it, right? You I guess it's kind of like, people who claim that like they're as persecuted as Galileo. Like, kind of a similar yellow flag goes up when people say like, no, yeah, I'm just as smart as Einstein, right? Or I'm persecuted like Galileo. It's like, yeah, but back it up, because those guys backed it up.
I don't know if I'm following you. In my mind, when you want to do anything, whether it's creating some plan to do something or trying to create something new, the brainstorming process, the further you push it out, the more crazy and imaginative and wild into sci-fi fantasy range. You can come up with all sorts of crazy ideas, but then you reel it back. Because if you only, an analogy someone described once, where if you drop the fishing line directly in front of you, you're limited to the number and type of fish that you're going to catch. But if you throw the fishing line way out and then you start to reel it back in, you have more likelihood of catching more varied and larger fish, right? So if you push the brainstorming out there to the crazy limits, to the thought experiments, and then you reel it back, well, then you can figure out how you're going to apply it or how you're going to make it work. But you can't do that as expansively, as imaginatively, if you don't push the limits of it, right?
Yeah, no, actually, I totally agree with everything you just said. Yeah, you have to push it, and then you have to pull it back, and you have to try and back it up, and like you have to cross things off the list. They're like, oh, never mind, that didn't work. You got to be willing to do that. That's actually what draws the line between like fantasy and science to me, and why like imagination is not synonymous with science, right? That's why we have different words for science and fantasy and sci-fi, right?
Sure. And I think fantasy we probably could throw out or toss to the side, but I'd like to think that
For
imagination.
imagination?
No, fantasy.
Okay.
But imagination and perhaps sci-fi, because there's a little bit more groundedness to some sci-fi. There's like I see imagination when someone's coding software, right? It may not appear that way from the surface if we're only considering imagination from an artistic perspective, but there's definitely imagination required there for problem solving, etc. And so I think of them as more hand in hand. And sci-fi, I guess, to me is a little closer in relation to imagination and science than perhaps fantasy. So I see them as more closely connected than not, I guess. I mean,
Right. Just like there's a line between hard sci-fi and soft sci-fi,
yeah,
right? The
yeah.
Expanse is more grounded in hard science than like Star Trek is, right? Which seems to be like, no, gravity plating is a thing, and like Expanse is at least like, no, you gotta have magnetic boots if you wanna walk around on a spaceship. Like, it's not rotating, so you don't get gravity.
The word fantasy, actually, as Christina was talking about it, and we don't have to talk about the fantasy, but it's something that is potentially attainable, but it may not be accessible to a given individual. This could be material thing, could be romance, uh, or something in general. Again, it's generally attainable, probably not hugely imaginative. It's just there. You just have a fantasy in terms of gaining access or having have it. or something to that effect. And it's kind of a pretty powerful word, actually, and usually it's being used kind of loosely in terms of, again, the field of wanting something, and in romantic kind of construct or kind of way of thinking, and perhaps maybe other realms too, but I haven't really. I just started thinking about it right now, and but I think I kind of agree with Jerry that there must be some presence of something. Then either we mix them up, and people talked about this. You guys have talked about it. We mix them up, we expand on it, we put them in different kind of order, we kind of stretch them a little bit, and then we arrive at a new place. And so it seems to me it must have some form of, I don't know, yeah, presence or something in our brain, either purely biologically or as well as the environmental stuff that gives us the kind of the stuff to come up with a new thing. And it kind of makes sense to me when Jerry was explaining it. And let me just give you a quick example of why this is the case. If somebody tells you that the universe is a hologram, you might say, well, that's being quite imaginative. How could you possibly say that? You're just talking from, out of your ears. But I think if you think about the development of this imaginative kind of concept, you can see that the science has laid out, the work. And you can see this with just a regular hologram, which is, you see a billions of dots on a film, on a sheet of film, a photographic film, which absolutely, when you look at it, there's absolutely no rhyme, no patterns, no structure. It's completely chaotic. Now you get a light and behind it, and then now out of those 2D points, you see this 3D images, and it could be bodies, geometric, spheres and cubics and things like that. And again, it's so then you take the same concept and you take it to the black holes, and thinking that all of the information that it goes into the black hole is kind of imprinted on the event horizon of the black hole, and that's is more proportional to the surface of the black hole to hold the information than it is actually to the volume of it. So do you see the imagination starting from what I said to the second place? Then now the thinking is, okay, how come the universe could be, sort of hologram? Completely fascinating, imaginative kind of concept. So if you can take the same concept into the cosmic horizon, which is being kind of like event horizon, except you're inside of the black hole, the universe, instead of being outside of it, the black hole. And now all of the information on the universe is projected on the two kind of on the cosmic horizon, and then us being kind of the hologram, a manifestation of that. And anything beyond the event cosmic horizon is not accessible to us, because the space is expanding at the rate higher than speed of light. Therefore, no information from outside is coming in, and contrast that to the black hole, which is no information from inside is going out. So you see how when we hear hologram, concept, we think it's very imaginative. But if you look back, there is a reasonable mathematical, solid kind of way of thinking gets us to that point. So that gets me back to Jerry's kind of concept that there's a path. There is when I'm talking about science here, not art. And so that kind of makes sense to see, and then that also takes us into this concept of duality. If this concept is correct, which is mathematically presumably is correct, then am I the 2D kind of dot on the cosmic horizon, or am I this image? So you see the duality kind of comes into this concept, which goes into realms that science doesn't want to go there. Anyway, the long story is I just wanted to kind of give a little bit more flesh to what Jerry was saying, in addition to what he was talking about before.
Yeah, thanks. I was curious if imagination can be harmful. Like, When would imagination be harmful?
I would say that when you're not making a clear distinction in your mind that it is not reality. For this is may not be a harmful example, but if you picture a lemon, then you picture biting into that lemon, there's going to be a bodily, manifestation of that in the chemistry. And so when it gets to the point, like for example, if you have a fear of heights, in the work that I do, what I've seen is it's not that you're afraid of heights. You're projecting yourself falling into a future, and it's not the present moment. You're in a future, and that kind of imagination is detrimental to your body. You can find all kinds of, you're going to start hyperventilating, your heart's going to start beating, et cetera, et cetera.
So imagination can be harmful when you're confusing it with reality.
Yeah, and it doesn't mean that. And so the difference, though, is like you can also. This is why I said earlier that it's a great servant and a terrible master, because if you see there's this potential of you falling, but you're not so attached to that thought and into the images and identification with the self, then you can just simply move away, and you won't have that terrified reaction.
Yeah, like the servant master thing is, it sounds like, you know, when you're using imagination instead of letting imagination use you, kind of thing, servant master.
Yeah, it's when people say, "Oh, I had the thought that so and so." Well, a lot of times it's the other way around. The thought has you, in
Uh-huh.
my experience.